Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Welcome to the Missing Dots, the place where silence is broken, assumptions are shattered, and the stories buried beneath centuries of tradition are brought into the light. Tonight, we step into a realm where history, faith, and mystery collide, a realm that challenges what we were taught to accept without question. Here, every belief is examined, every narrative is tested, and every untouchable topic is placed under the microscope. If you're ready to confront the questions others avoid, to explore the shadows behind the official story, and to connect the dots no one dared to connect, then you're exactly where you need to be.
Alhamdulillah. It's good to be sitting here with you.
Yeah, same here. Just, sitting out here in the courtyard after prayer. It's quiet. And we've got a pretty massive stack of history to go through today.
We really do.
Because we're looking at this huge phenomenon, Sufism or tasawwuf. And I think for you listening, when you hear the word Sufism, you probably picture something very specific.
Right. Usually the aesthetic.
Exactly. Like whirling dervishes in Turkey, or, those beautiful Rumi quotes on Instagram, or even massive shrines. But reading the actual history, it didn't start like that at all.
No, not even close.
It was so grounded. It was a deeply human reaction to a world that just felt completely broken.
Yeah, that is the perfect way to look at it, because to really understand it, you have to go back. We have to look at the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Islamic calendar.
So like the 7th and 8th centuries.
Exactly. You have this community going through just massive disorienting change. The Prophet Muhammad had passed away.
Right.
And this intimate, relatively simple community in Medina was suddenly exploding. It became this vast imperial civilization under the Umayyad dynasty.
And we really have to think about what that actually felt like for a normal person back then.
Oh, it was a complete shock to the system.
Right, because they went from surviving in the desert, literally sharing dates and water, to suddenly controlling all the wealth of Persia and Byzantium.
The wealth was unimaginable.
You had palaces going up in Damascus, massive wealth inequality.
And with that material wealth, you get brutal political strife. I mean, this is the era of the first fitna, the first civil war.
Which is just heartbreaking to even think about.
It is. And crucially, it's the era of the tragedy at Karbala.
Let's actually pause on Karbala for a second, because the sources really point to that as a psychological breaking point for the believers.
It absolutely was.
For those listening who might not know, we are talking about the Prophet's own grandson, Hussein, being slaughtered by the army of the empire, an empire that claims to uphold the Prophet's religion.
Yeah, I mean, just imagine the sheer cognitive dissonance that caused. Sincere believers were watching their rulers live like absolute kings, right?
Yeah.
Hoarding wealth, using violence. And meanwhile, the actual family of the Prophet is being killed.
It's just devastating.
So they looked at society and just felt this huge spiritual vacuum. The outward form of the religion, the borders, the state, the laws, it was all expanding. But the inner heart of it felt like it was dying.
Which is so relatable, honestly. Like, if you look at your own life today, have you ever just felt totally burned out by the corporate grind?
Oh, absolutely. Hustle culture.
Right. You see the greed in the world, the obsession with status. And sometimes you just want to throw your phone in the ocean, move to a cabin somewhere, and just, find your soul again.
That is exactly what these early Muslims were feeling. Exactly that.
They just wanted out.
Yeah, the politics were there, the laws were there, but the spirit was lost. So people just started walking away from the cities. They retreated.
And this is what the historical texts call zuhd, right? Asceticism.
Yes, zuhd. It was a very conscious choice to just live with less. And they made it visible.
How so?
Well, these pious individuals would intentionally wear this really coarse, scratchy wool. And the Arabic word for wool is suf.
Ah, so that's where the name comes from, Sufi.
Most likely, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, wearing rough wool in the boiling heat of the Middle East, it was a physical protest. A daily rejection of the silken luxury in the Umayyad courts.
Like a silent boycott.
Exactly. A quiet internal protest. They were trying to preserve Ihsan.
Which is worshiping God as if you see him.
Right. They felt like comfort and wealth were literally putting their souls to sleep. So the physical discomfort of the wool kept their hearts awake.
Man, that brings us to Hassan al-Basri. Reading about him was wild. He lived in the 8th century, right?
Yes, in Basra, though he grew up in Medina.
Right, around the actual companions of the Prophet. But his psychological state, it's just fascinating. His whole approach was built on khawf.
Which means a profound fear of God.
Yeah, the biographies say he was constantly weeping. But it wasn't like a paralyzing terror, was it?
No, we have to be careful not to misunderstand that. It was more like this intense awe, a hyper-awareness of his own flaws.
Like an extreme caution.
Exactly. He was always on guard against hypocrisy. He was terrified that his good deeds were secretly just driven by pride.
Imagine living like that, holding yourself to that standard every single minute. It sounds exhausting,
It
honestly.
was rigorous.
But also incredibly pure. But then, not long after him, the tone shifts. And it shifts in this really beautiful way with another figure from Basra, Rabia Adawiya.
Oh, Rabia. She is remarkable.
She completely changes the paradigm, right? From fear to mahabba, divine love.
Yes. She lived a life of total voluntary poverty, and she explicitly rejected the idea that worship should just be a transaction.
Like a business deal with God.
Right. There is this very famous supplication of hers. She would pray in the middle of the night, and she'd say, "Oh God, if I worship you from fear of hell, burn me in hell.
Wow.
And if I worship you in hope of paradise, forbid it to me. But if I worship you for your own sake, do not withhold from me your eternal beauty."
SubhanAllah, that is just incredible. She's stripping away all the conditions.
It's radical sincerity. She's basically saying, if you only obey God to get a reward, you're a merchant. If you do it to avoid punishment, you're a slave.
But a true believer just obeys out of love
Mm.
because he is worthy of it.
Yeah, exactly. And it just shows how focused this early movement was on the internal state, wrestling with the ego.
But this is where I start to hit a wall, to be honest.
How so?
Because I read these histories and I wonder, how does that quiet piety turn into the massive systems we see later?
The institutionalization.
Yeah. You go from a woman sitting alone in a hut, praying out of pure love, to these giant, organized global orders, strict rules, hierarchies. How does a personal retreat turn into a system?
Well, it's an inevitable trajectory, really.
Mm.
Individual inspiration always seeks structure eventually. Otherwise, it just dies out with that one person.
I guess that makes sense.
As more people sought out these ascetics for advice, on how to purify their hearts, a master-disciple relationship just naturally formed.
Because they needed guidance.
Right? But more importantly, these early figures started writing down their internal experiences. They were basically mapping the human mind centuries before modern clinical psychology even existed.
So who was the pioneer there? Did someone actually sit down and write a manual?
Yes. A key figure is Al-Muhasibi. He lived in the 9th century. And his name literally implies the one who takes himself to account.
Fitting.
Very. He wrote a manual called Kitab al-Riaya. It's essentially a masterclass in spiritual psychology. He meticulously mapped out the ego, the nafs.
How did he actually do that, though? Like, what did his therapy look like in practice?
He analyzed how subconscious intentions can corrupt good deeds, things like pride, envy, self-deception.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, so imagine you give money to a beggar in the marketplace. Al-Muhasibi would tell his students to go home, sit down, and literally interrogate their own minds.
Really dig into it.
Exactly. He'd ask, did you feel a slight rush of superiority over that beggar? Did you look around to see if anyone was watching you?
Oh, wow.
Did you secretly hope someone would praise your generosity?
Because if you did, the deed is corrupted.
Precisely. You didn't do it for God. You did it for your own reputation. They called that hidden desire to be seen Riya.
It's basically clinical therapy on the ego.
It is. They categorize the stages of the self so carefully. The commanding soul that pushes you to do wrong, the self-reproaching soul that feels guilt, and finally, the tranquil soul.
The tranquil soul that's at peace with God's will. It's brilliant. But, as this psychological framework grew, it eventually had to clash with the mainstream legalistic side of Islam, right?
It did. And that intersection is defined by one absolute historical heavyweight, Al-Ghazali.
Al-Ghazali. He is the bridge.
Without him, Islamic history might look totally different today.
For you listening, Ghazali's story is almost like a movie. He's sitting at the absolute pinnacle of the academic world in Baghdad in the 11th century.
He was a superstar professor at the Nizamiya University.
Right. Wealthy, connected to rulers, respected by literally everyone, and then he just breaks down.
A profound, paralyzing existential crisis.
What exactly happened to him?
He realized his entire career, his mastery of intellectual theology, kalam, was just theory. It wasn't enough.
Right. He wrote in his autobiography that he actually lost his ability to speak.
Yes, a physical symptom. He would stand at the podium in front of hundreds of students, and no words would come out. He became physically ill.
Wow.
He realized that reading about water doesn't quench your thirst. You have to taste it. experiential knowledge. They call it doc.
So he just walks away from everything, leaves his prestigious job, gives away his wealth, and spends years wandering in Damascus and Jerusalem.
Living as an obscure ascetic, sweeping floors. And when he finally came back to teaching over a decade later, he wrote his magnum opus, the Isha Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences.
And how did that book change the landscape?
It changed everything, because Ghazali was an undisputed master of Islamic law, the Sharia. By integrating the inner psychology of the Sufis with the outer rules of the law, he bridged the gap.
So he tied them together.
Yes. He argued that outward rituals without inner presence are just dead movements. A prayer without focus is just gymnastics. But, and this is crucial, he also argued that inner spirituality, without the strict boundaries of Islamic law, is a dangerous delusion.
So he basically saved mainstream Islam from splitting into two completely separate religions. One just dry rules, the other just unchecked mysticism.
Exactly. He legitimized Sufism for the orthodox scholars, and he anchored the mystics back to the law.
Which makes perfect sense on paper, but as the system solidifies after Ghazali, we get the tariqas, the organized Sufi orders. And with that comes the Murshid-Murid dynamic.
The master and the disciple.
Right. And I have to push back on this a bit, just thinking aloud based on the critiques we've read. This concept often demands total obedience to a sheikh.
It does.
And the goal is fana, the annihilation of the ego, usually through intense discipline under this master. But doesn't that inherently risk creating a cult of personality?
It's a very valid concern.
Because Islam places such a heavy emphasis on a direct, unmediated relationship with Allah. You don't confess to a priest, so how did classical scholars justify surrendering your free will to a human sheikh?
It's a tension they were acutely aware of. And total obedience is easily misunderstood from the outside, but yes, it's also easily abused on the inside. But authentic classical Sufism mandated severe safeguards against cult-like behavior.
What kind of safeguards? Because handing over your will sounds dangerous.
The primary safeguard was the absolute supremacy of the Sharia. The rule was that a sheikh is bound by the exact same laws as the disciple.
Okay.
Al-Junayd, a master of sober Sufism, famously said, "Our path is bounded by the book and the sunnah." If a sheikh commands something against Islamic law, the contract is broken. You are obligated to disobey.
So the sheikh is never above the law?
Never. If a sheikh claims he's reached some spiritual state where the rules don't apply to him, classical scholars consider him a heretic, not a master.
Interesting.
They didn't view the sheikh as a redeemer you worship. They viewed him as a mountain guide.
A mountain guide?
Yeah. If you're climbing a treacherous peak, you need someone who knows where the avalanches happen, where the crevasses are. The sheikh helps you navigate the avalanches of your own ego. But you're still doing the climbing, and you're climbing toward Allah, not toward the guide.
Okay, I see your point. A mountain guide keeps you from walking off a cliff in the dark. But let me stop you there, because a mountain guide doesn't demand you kiss his hand, or dictate who you can marry, or what career you should pursue.
True.
And we see that level of control happening in some of these historical tariqas. It goes way beyond just spiritual advice.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that is exactly where the system began to decay in certain places.
Yeah.
When the sheikh transitioned from a spiritual advisor to a feudal lord or a political figurehead, the abuses crept in.
Yeah.
Classical scholars actually warned constantly about false sheikhs who preyed on the ignorant. They wrote extensively on how to identify a charlatan.
And as we move forward in history, that mountain guide analogy gets lost more and more because as these sheikhs became powerful figures, the local cultures started projecting their own myths onto them.
Yes, the hagiographies, the biographies of the saints.
Right. And this is where the water gets really murky in the sources.
Yeah.
We start seeing this massive explosion of supernatural claims, legends, wild miracles attached to these figures.
When we talk about miracles in Islamic theology, we have to make a careful distinction. There are mujizat, which are undeniable miracles given to prophets.
Like Moses parting the sea or Jesus healing the blind.
Exactly. And then there are karamat, which are wonders granted to pious saints.
But mainstream theology does accept karamat, right?
It does, fully. The Quran mentions the wonders surrounding Maryam, the mother of Jesus, or the story of the people of the cave sleeping for centuries. The theological door is open.
Okay, the possibility isn't denied. But the scale of the stories in these later Sufi biographies, it goes to a whole different level. As a listener, if you read some of these texts, it literally sounds like ancient fantasy literature.
It really does. You find stories that strain all boundaries, claims of teleportation.
Right.
They called it Te Alard, the folding of the earth. A saint is suddenly hundreds of miles away in Mecca for Friday prayers, and back in his village by afternoon.
And claims of bilocation.
Being in two places at once. Saints talking to animals, controlling jinn, resurrecting the dead.
So how did these wild stories get attached to these humble ascetics who just wanted to weep in the desert?
It mostly comes down to the Quasas.
Storytellers.
Yes, professional storytellers. Long before mass media, if you went to a marketplace or a mosque courtyard, you'd find these Quasas. Their job was to entertain, to edify, and frankly, to hold a crowd so they could earn a living.
And to hold a crowd, you need a good story.
Precisely. So they took real historical scholars and embellished their lives. They borrowed from Persian epics, Indian folklore, Christian monastic legends, and grafted them onto Sufi masters.
It's ancient marketing. I mean, think about your social media feed today. The algorithm prioritizes shock value,
Right.
engagement, things that go viral.
Exactly.
A quiet, boring truth doesn't get clicks. The Quasas were the algorithm of their day. A story about a scholar praying all night doesn't draw a massive crowd. But a scholar flying on a prayer rug over the river, that gets a crowd.
That is a brilliant analogy. It was viral marketing for the spiritual lineages. If a local order wanted to show their founding sheikh was superior to the guy in the next town, a miraculous story was a great way to build prestige.
But wait, if these stories were just marketplace entertainment, how did they end up in the religious texts? If the scholars were so rigorous about the Sharia, why did they let these fabrications slide?
Well, the rigorous scholars didn't let them slide. They were fiercely critical. You have heavyweights like Ibn al-Jawzi in the 12th century, the ultimate orthodox watchdog of Baghdad.
Right.
He wrote an entire book critiquing these storytellers.
So how did they filter the stories? Did they just say, this sounds totally fake?
No, they used a highly sophisticated system. They applied the exact same critical method they used for verifying sayings of the prophet, the isnad, the chain of transmission.
So they'd ask for sources.
Yes. If a storyteller claimed a saint flew, Ibn al-Jawzi would say, "Who told you this?" And they'd trace the chain back. Time and time again, they found the narrators were unknown or known liars, or the timeline was physically impossible.
So they applied pure academic rigor to the folklore.
They did, because they understood a real saint doesn't need to fly. One scholar noted, birds fly and fish swim. A true saint is someone who walks among people, buys and sells, marries, and never forgets God for a single moment.
That is the real miracle.
Exactly. But why do the stories remain popular today? Human nature. People love the supernatural. It provides comfort to believe that kind of mystical power exists in a hard world.
And that popularity, that blending of local myth, inevitably triggered a massive theological backlash.
A huge one.
Because Orthodox scholars looked at people gathering around graves telling stories about flying saints, and they drew a very hard line. This is where the sectarian lines we see today really get defined.
The backlash centered on two main accusations. Bid'ah, which means religious innovation, and shirk, which is associating partners with God, polytheism.
Those are the heaviest accusations you can make in Islam. You're basically saying someone is stepping outside the faith.
They are the ultimate red lines. And the critics looked at specific practices. A prime example is tawassul, seeking intercession through deceased saints.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that. How does tawassul actually work in practice, and why the uproar?
In practice, a person might go to the grave of a famous saint. They stand there and ask the saint to pray to Allah on their behalf. Like, "Oh saint, you are close to God. Please ask him to cure my child."
And the critics view that as resembling the pre-Islamic practices in Mecca, right? Where people prayed to idols to act as middlemen with God.
Yes.
They argue the Quran constantly emphasizes a direct connection to Allah. He's closer to you than your jugular vein. You don't need a middleman.
Exactly. The strict traditionalists argued that asking the dead for help is an act of worship directed at someone other than God, which is shirk. But the defenders of tawassul argue they are absolutely not worshiping the saint. They believe the saint has no independent power. They're just using the saint's piety as a means to draw near to God.
It's a profound disagreement about the very mechanics of prayer.
It is.
And this tension extends to other things, too. Massive festivals at shrines, the maulids celebrating the prophet's birthday, and the use of music and dancing, like the sama and the whirling dervishes.
The dancing is a fascinating debate. The whirling dervishes, associated with Rumi, began as spontaneous meditation in motion, muraqabah.
Deep contemplation.
Right. The spinning was meant to mirror the planets orbiting the sun, a physical manifestation of a soul orbiting the divine center.
It sounds beautiful in theory.
It is. But over time, what started as a deeply personal, spontaneous expression morphed into an institutionalized, choreographed public ritual.
And the critics look at that and say, the prophet and his companions didn't choreograph dances or use instruments to worship.
Exactly. It comes back to this eternal tension. The zahir, the literal letter of the law, versus the batin, the inward spirit of the law.
And that tension reaches its absolute breaking point with what the texts call shadahat, ecstatic utterances.
This is very dangerous territory. We're talking about figures like Al-Hallaj in the 10th century.
Right.
He was this intense mystic who, in a state of spiritual ecstasy, publicly yelled out, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, or I am God.
Which is unambiguous blasphemy. I mean, if someone walked into a mosque today and yelled that, they'd be thrown out immediately.
Unambiguous on the face of it, yes.
Yeah.
It led to a massive political and theological trial in Baghdad. He was ultimately executed.
Wow.
But his defenders argued he wasn't claiming his physical body was God. He was describing a state of fauna. His ego was so annihilated that he felt only the presence of God acting through him.
But I mean, I wonder about the danger of that ambiguous language. If someone says, I am the truth, while intoxicated spiritually, shouldn't they still be accountable? Where's the line between poetic metaphor and actual blasphemy?
That is the big question.
Because if anyone can just claim they were in an ecstatic state, the boundaries of the religion completely dissolve. You could justify anything.
And that is precisely the argument of the traditionalist critics. Subjective spiritual states do not give you a license to trample objective law.
Right.
And this is where Ibn Taymiyyah enters the picture in the 13th and 14th centuries. He provided the most rigorous, systematic critique of all this.
How did he approach it? Because he wasn't just anti-spirituality, right?
No, that is a huge misconception. Ibn Taymiyyah deeply respected the early ascetics, Hassan al-Basri, al-Junayd. He praised their adherence to the Quran and Sunnah,
Okay.
but he vehemently rejected grave veneration, music and worship, and most importantly, the philosophical language that had entered Sufism.
Specifically regarding the theories of Ibn Arabi, let's spend some time on this because it's dense but so crucial. Ibn Arabi is known as the Shaykh al-Akbar, the greatest master to his followers.
Yes.
But his ideas caused absolute chaos among Orthodox scholars.
Because Ibn Arabi developed this highly complex concept called wadat al-wujud, the unity of being.
Right.
The idea is that all existence is ultimately one. The multiplicity of things we see is just a manifestation of a single divine reality.
So to an average person hearing that on the street, it sounds like he's saying a tree is God, the sky is God, you are God.
Right. And Ibn Taymiyyah viewed this as effectively pantheism.
Yeah.
If everything is God, the distinction between creator and created is lost.
And if that's lost, it destroys Islamic monotheism, it destroys accountability. If the sinner and the saint are both just manifestations of the divine, what's the point of the law?
Exactly. It's a devastating critique.
How do Ibn Arabi's defenders even respond to that? Because obviously they don't believe they're worshiping trees.
They respond by saying it's not literal pantheism, it is a phenomenological experience. Let's use an analogy.
Okay.
Think of a shadow cast by a tree. A shadow has no independent existence. It only exists because of the tree and the sunlight. If the sun goes away, the shadow is gone. It has no reality of its own. When defenders of Wadat al-Wujud say everything is one, they are saying the universe is like that shadow.
Oh, I see.
It is continuously dependent on the sustaining power of God. Compared to the absolute reality of God, the physical universe is basically an illusion. So they aren't saying the stone is God. They're saying the stone only exists because God allows it to in every single microsecond.
That makes sense. They're arguing it's a profound realization of God's majesty, not a claim that the physical world is divine. But you can see how easily that high-level philosophy gets misunderstood.
Oh, incredibly easily.
If you preach that in a marketplace, people are going to take it literally.
And that was Ibn Taymiyyah's whole point. He argued that even if elite philosophers understood it as metaphor, the language itself was dangerous and led commoners astray. It was a massive theological battlefield.
It really was. But what's fascinating is that while these intense high-level debates were happening internally in places like Cairo and Damascus, Sufism was having a completely different impact outwardly.
Yes, globally.
It was interacting with the rest of the world in ways that literally changed the map.
Historically, while theologians debated, Sufism was the primary vehicle for spreading Islam to vast parts of the world: West Africa, South and Southeast Asia.
Like Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country today. Islam wasn't spread there by armies.
No, it was spread by Sufi orders, the Chishtiya order in South Asia, for example.
Right. The Sufis were merchants, wanderers, teachers.
They embedded themselves in communities. They offered a very inclusive, heart-centered approach. They didn't arrive arguing about the unity of being. They arrived with good character.
They built lodges, right? Zawiyas or khanqahs, which were basically community centers, feeding the poor, educating people, sheltering travelers.
They adapted to local cultures while preserving the core doctrine. And later, during European colonialism, these same Sufi networks formed the backbone of fierce anti-colonial resistance.
Which is a part of history that gets completely overlooked. We always think of Sufis as passive mystics sitting in caves.
But the reality is entirely different.
You have figures like Imam Shamil, a deeply devoted Naqshbandi Sufi master, and he led a decades-long military resistance against the Russian Empire in the Caucasus.
Or Emir Abdelkader in Algeria,
Yeah.
fighting the French occupation. He was a master of the sword and the pen. Deeply influenced by Ibn Arabi, actually.
It just shatters the stereotype. It shows their spiritual discipline, their fasting was deeply connected to social justice and defending their communities. They didn't retreat when their people were attacked. They led from the front.
Their inner conquest of the ego gave them the courage to face outward oppression.
Yeah.
But as we pivot to the modern era, the interaction between Sufism and the outside world takes a very different, controversial turn. We encounter what we might call the modern Rumi problem.
The Rumi problem, it is wild to think about. Jalal al-Din Rumi, a 13th century Islamic scholar, jurist, and mystic in Anatolia.
Yes.
And today, he is consistently ranked as one of the best-selling poets in the United States. His words are on coffee mugs, read at weddings, posted all over social media.
But the Rumi most people in the West know is heavily filtered.
Significantly filtered. Rumi's original monumental work, the Mathnawi, is steeped in the Quran. It's embedded in Islamic theology and law. It's often called the Quran in the Persian language.
Yes, but translators in the West, most notably Coleman Barks in the late 20th century, actively stripped those elements away.
Why did they do that? Just to sell books?
They wanted to make it more universal. They removed specific references to the Prophet Muhammad. They removed the Quranic verses, mentions of Islamic practice like fasting.
They just extracted the aesthetic of love and longing.
Exactly. But they severed it from the strict religious discipline that produced that love in the first place.
They made it marketable, generic, New Age spirituality. It relates exactly to what we talked about earlier with Al-Ghazali.
The Sharia being the container.
Right. Stripping the law and discipline from Sufism destroys its actual purpose. Ghazali and Rumi themselves insisted on this. Without the container of the law, the water of spirituality just spills into the dirt.
Academic consensus is very clear on this. The de-Islamicized Rumi is a distortion. It presents him as a generic guru who just loved everyone and drank wine.
Instead of a devout Muslim scholar whose entire capacity for love was shaped by his faith.
Exactly.
And we see this play out today in what sociological papers call digital Sufism. You look online and you have Instagram sheikhs, YouTube Dhikr sessions, commercialized Qawwali music. The sacred is packaged for mass consumption.
When you remove the face-to-face master-disciple relationship, the silent contemplation, and replace it with a digital broadcast designed for likes, you fundamentally alter the practice.
It becomes entertainment.
It becomes an aesthetic rather than a path of purification.
It's like wanting the physical fitness of an Olympic athlete, but you only want to buy the expensive shoes.
That is the perfect analogy.
You don't want to do the early morning workouts, the strict diet, the pain of training. People want the feeling of the mystical experience, the beautiful quotes, but they don't want the rigor, the fasting, waking up in the middle of the night to pray. They want the fruit without planting the tree.
That is the modern dilemma.
Yeah.
We want the spiritual high without the spiritual work. And maybe that brings us full circle.
Back to the beginning.
Yeah, to those early ascetics in the desert, wearing rough wool, intentionally walking away from the noise and distractions of the Umayyad Empire to find a quiet place to be with God.
Hassan al-Basri and Rabia al-Adawiya, they just wanted authenticity.
Yes, and that remains the enduring challenge today. In an age of algorithms, where all human knowledge is on our phones, and we are constantly bombarded by digital noise.
We're exhausted by it.
We are. Perhaps the one thing we are truly starved of is the exact thing those early Muslims sought. Genuine, silent presence with the divine, completely free from the noise of the world.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.